the studio at bbcworldservice.com/in-the-studio. At bbcworldservice.com, people fixing the world.
We're talking about sports fans and looking at ways to reduce violence and racism at the games with a football fan project in Germany and a club getting black women into ice hockey in the US.
OS is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to OS with James Reynolds, live from the floor of the BBC's newsroom here in central London. Brazil's defeated former President Jair Bolsonaro has returned to his home country from his self-imposed exile in the United States. The far-right former leader, who lost his re-election attempt last October, landed in the capital Brasilia on a commercial flight from Florida, where he'd spent the last 89 days. There were more police officers than supporters at the airport. The former leader was led out by a side exit. Jair Bolsonaro left the country at the end of December, 2 days before the end of his presidential term. The leftist leader who beat him in the election, Lula, was then sworn in as normal. A week after that, some Bolsonaro supporters stormed Congress in Brasilia, the capital. More than 1,500 were arrested. Mr. Bolsonaro now faces an investigation into whether or not he incited the rioters. He denies the charge.
This is Danielle Yawowiecka with the BBC News. Hello. Brazil's far-right former president Jair Bolsonaro has returned to his home country after 3 months of self-imposed exile in the United States. Supporters draped in Brazil flags met his plane as it arrived in the capital, Brasilia. Among them was Eva Melgaço. We've been waiting for this moment for a long time. We've been looking forward to this moment since January the 1st. He needed this moment for himself in a place very far away. As a patriot and as a Brazilian, I supported his departure. Before leaving Florida, Mr. Bolsonaro downplayed his leadership role, saying only that he looked forward to helping his Liberal Party win next year's local elections. A court in Russia has placed a journalist working for the US newspaper The Wall Street Journal under formal arrest on charges of spying for the American government. Evan Gershkovich has been remanded in custody for 2 months. Russia's domestic security service said he'd been gathering classified information. The Wall Street Journal has denied the accusations. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg says the newspaper will be concerned.
It's very difficult once the wheels of the Russian legal system, the justice system, start to turn. Now, because this case is about espionage, a lot of the details will be top secret, so it will be quite difficult to find out what's going on. We went down to the courthouse in Moscow, where Evan was brought earlier today. We spoke to a lawyer who had been appointed for him, who wasn't given access even to Evan, to the courtroom, and couldn't actually tell us what was going on. So even for the lawyer, it was quite difficult to find out what was happening today.
4 bank executives who helped a close associate of President Putin move millions of dollars through a Swiss branch of a Russian bank have been found guilty of a lack of due diligence on money deposited by the Russian musician Sergei Ravtugin. The court in Switzerland issued fines to the 4 unnamed bankers who worked for Gazprom Bank. They say they'll appeal. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has warned that China's ruling Communist Party intends to change the international order systemically to put China at its centre. She said Beijing was moving from an era of what she called reform and opening to one of security and control. Ms von der Leyen said that EU countries had to reduce the risks of economic trade with Beijing.
While imbalances are growing, most of our trade in goods and services remains mutual beneficial and unrisky. But our relationship is unbalanced and increasingly affected by distortions created by China's state capitalist system. So we need to rebalance this relationship on the basis of transparency, predictability, and reciprocity.
International Olympic Committee has hit back at criticism from some European governments of its decision to recommend that athletes from Russia and Belarus be allowed to return to international competition. On Tuesday, the IOC said individual Russian and Belarusian athletes could compete as neutral competitors if they weren't connected to the military and hadn't endorsed the war in Ukraine. Alex Capstick reports.
The International Olympic Committee's plans for the return of athletes from Russia and Belarus have angered some European nations, but the IOC President Thomas Bach described their criticism as deplorable and attacked them for having double standards. Over the last 48 hours, politicians, including those from Ukraine, the Czech Republic and Poland, have expressed concern over the inclusion of athletes from the two countries. Last month, a group of more than 30 nations, including Great Britain, the USA, France and Germany, pledged support for Russia and Belarus to remain banned. A defiant Mr. Bach said an overwhelming majority within the Olympic movement backed the recommendations.
A leading Senegalese opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko, has been found guilty of libel and handed a 2-month suspended jail sentence. Mr. Sonko was charged with libel after accusing the country's tourism minister of embezzlement. Mr. Sonko's lawyers say the sentence is not expected to prevent him from running in presidential elections next year. BBC News.
James Reynolds with you on OS from the BBC World Service. We continue to broadcast from our home right here on a small white table in the middle of the BBC's main newsroom in central London. On social media a little earlier in the day, I posted a picture of exactly where we are in comparison to the hundreds of other journalists, and I asked one of my colleagues to go up to the mezzanine floor to take a picture of me in this position, and she looked at me after, she said, I couldn't even see you, you were that far away. So I posted whatever I could on social media. I've added a giant pink arrow to show exactly where we sit. So if you're on social media, have a look at James BBC News on Twitter and you'll get a sense of exactly where we are, surrounded by journalists working on all sorts of TV, radio and online output. Just a few seconds ago there was some applause for a departing colleague. That's because some of the BBC's TV channels are merging. They're trying out a new operation. They're piloting some of their new schemes and tricks here at a big screen next to me with giant lights which are shining directly almost into my eyes. So if you hear me losing my place, it's not possibly because I've got worse at reading, it's because of the lights in my eyes from our TV colleagues. Let's crack on with the news and bring that to you because we want to start in Brazil, where the far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro, who lost October's re-election campaign, has returned to his own country after 3 months of self-imposed exile in the United States. He'd been spending that time in Florida, and he flew to Florida just 2 days before his successor, the leftist Lula, was to be sworn in. A plane carrying the ex-leader landed in the capital Brasilia, where Mr. Bolsonaro, as you'll hear, was met by supporters draped in Brazil flags. You can hear their delight there, the fact that Jair Bolsonaro is back in Brazil, but he may have 1 or 2 legal problems facing him. Let's discuss everything with Camila Mota, our correspondent from BBC Brazil, who's in Sao Paulo. Camila, thanks so much for joining us. Do we know why Jair Bolsonaro has come back now, 89 days after he left? Did his US visa simply run out?
Well, we don't know about that, James. We don't have information about his visa status, and it's not very clear why he decided to come back now. There are a few factors, though, that might be involved. The Brazilian economy is moving at a slow pace, so he might have thought that this is a good time to show up. There's still no clear leader of the opposition 3 months into the Lula government, and 3 political parties are starting to strategize to the local elections in 2024. And Bolsonaro is seen as a good campaigner, someone that could help his Liberal Party to win votes for its candidates for city mayor next year. In fact, he went straight from the airport to the headquarters of his party.
There were a number of events in January in Brazil that, Camila, you covered, and I met you in Sao Paulo at that time. Lula was sworn in, Mr. Bolsonaro left, and on the 8th of January, supporters of Jair Bolsonaro raided the Congress. More than 1,500 have been arrested. Tell us about the status of the investigation into Jair Bolsonaro for events on that day, the storming.
Right, so Bolsonaro has been investigated on inciting the riots, but this is still in its very early stages. Actually, Bolsonaro came back to a very challenging landscape in which he's investigated on multiple occasions. He's entangled in a very controversial story with Saudi Arabia involving jewelry given to him by the Saudi government. He actually has depositions scheduled for next Thursday with the federal police to explain himself. And besides, there are 16 lawsuits against him in Brazil's Superior Electoral Court, some accusing him of abuse of power during the 2022 elections, of spreading disinformation, casting doubt about the electoral system, and as mentioned, he's also been investigated in the probe into the January 8th riots in Brasilia. So he has a lot on his plate right now.
Camilla, in those 89 days in which he was in Florida, we saw occasional pictures of him visiting fast food restaurants, taking pictures with supporters, given how many people of Latin American origin are in Florida. Do you have any sense of what he's going to do with his time now that he's back home?
Right, so this is also a big question that needs to be answered. He gave an interview yesterday in which he said that he's too young to retire. He's 68 years old. So we might see him involved in politics still. But surprisingly, in that same interview, he said that he would not lead the opposition against Lula, the current incumbent. And at the same time, you know, this is the first time in 30 years that Bolsonaro doesn't have political immunity. He's been in politics for over 30 years. He has a political dynasty of his own. 3 of his sons are politicians, and now he's going to be tried in common justice. So I think that a lot of what Bolsonaro will do in politics will depend on his legal problems and how he'll have to deal with them.
I wonder if there's been any reaction from President Lula, the leftist president who beat Jair Bolsonaro in that October election.
From his return, no. Lula hasn't issued a statement or anything. There's a big government announcing today about the new fiscal framework, so they are very focused on that. They're giving a press conference at this minute, actually.
Camila Mota, our correspondent, BBC Brazil in Sao Paulo, thank you so much for joining us. James Rhodes with you on OS from the BBC. We turn our attention to the latest on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because ever since Russian troops launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February last year, the world has had a number of questions, including this: would Vladimir Putin at any stage be prepared to contemplate the use of nuclear weapons in the invasion that he began? Senior Russian officials have dropped a number of hints on the matter. It's a question our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, who's covered Russia for decades, put to Russian journalist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Dmitry Muratov when the two of them met in Moscow.
Задает вопрос, почему не Ватикан? Кто? Да, почему эти люди?
The Russian authorities may have shut down his newspaper, but Dmitry Muratov refuses to be silenced. When we meet in Moscow, Russia's Nobel Peace Prize laureate is worried about how far the Kremlin will go in its confrontation with the West.
2, считайте, поколения жили без ядерного оружия.
2 generations have lived without the threat of nuclear war. But this period is over. Will Putin press the nuclear button, or won't he? Who knows? No one knows this. There isn't a single person who can say for sure.
С полной уверенностью скажут нет. Не нажмут.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, Moscow's nuclear saber-rattling has been loud and frequent. There have been strategic nuclear drills and unsubtle hints to the West not to push Russia too far. A few days ago, Vladimir Putin announced plans to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. But then, one of his closest aides warned that Russia has a unique weapon capable of destroying any enemy, including America. Is it all a bluff?
this missile, that missile, another kind of missile. They talk about targeting Britain and France, about sparking a nuclear tsunami that washes away America. Why do they say this? So that people here are ready.
Люди в России были облучены пропагандой. Пропаганда.
People in Russia have been irradiated by propaganda. Propaganda is a type of radiation. Everyone is susceptible to it, not just Russians. In Russia, propaganda is 12 TV channels, tens of thousands of newspapers, social media, like the Russian version of Facebook, that completely serve the state ideology.
Jest завтра не станет пропаганда. But what if, I asked Dmitry Muratov, what if tomorrow propaganda suddenly stops? If it all goes quiet, what would Russians think and say then?
Вижу, что молодое, великолепное, образованное, прекрасное поколение
Our younger generation is wonderful. They're well educated. Nearly 1 million Russians have left the country. Many of those who've stayed are categorically against what is happening in Ukraine. They are against the hell that Russia has created there. I am convinced that as soon as the propaganda stops, this generation, and everyone else with common sense, will speak out.
Last year, Dmitry Muratov auctioned off his Nobel Peace Prize to raise money for Ukrainian child refugees. What does he think the future holds for Russia?
я вижу, что уже никогда
Never again will there be normal relations between the people of Russia and the people of Ukraine. Never. In Russia, political repression will continue against all opponents of the regime. My only hope lies with the young generation that see this world as a friend, not as an enemy. They want Russia to be loved and for Russia to love the world. I hope that this generation will outlive me and Putin.
Much will depend on what happens in Ukraine, on when and how this war ends, and what the political consequences will be for the Kremlin leader.
there didn't seem to be an exit, an emergency exit, and this is of course what seems to have caused a problem, that when this locked cell door, this bar door wasn't opened, it seems, by the security guards, these people were trapped when the fire spread and the flames and the smoke caused them to die.
We heard from Anna Maria how many different nationalities were amongst the victims. Have the families of those who died been able to get information about what happened to their relatives? Have they been able to visit?
Well, Alejandra Corona told me that this was one of the family's complaints, that some of the updated figures that they were given still were erroneous, that some people that were said to be in a serious state, they had survived but were supposed to be in a serious state, weren't. So you can imagine the anguish of people who are trying to get more information, and with these figures going up and down, this was one of the things that they said increased their anguish at such a difficult time.
The Mexican government, clearly there's the legal investigation going on, but looking at the Mexican government more widely, what kind of issue is this for the authorities?
It's a huge problem for the authorities because they're dealing with so many migrants. In December, there were 250,000 encounters that the Border Patrol, the US Border Patrol, had at the US-Mexico border. And what the US government is trying to do is trying to get the Mexican government and Mexican officials to deal with many of these migrants. That's why these raids of migrants have increased in cities like Ciudad Juarez. And many of those who died had been rounded up in the previous days as they arrived at airports, bus terminals, and even some of them were picked up in the streets where they had been selling candy and washing windscreens in order to make ends meet.
Do we get a sense, Vanessa, of numbers, of the kind of numbers going from Latin America to Mexico eventually to try to get to the States?
Yes, there was a record number of migrants, migrant encounters in December, 250,000. That number went down in January and February to about just under 130,000 because this US policy, which allows the US government to expel migrants very quickly, which is called Title 42, remained in place. And so a lot of the migrants decided to not risk crossing. But as Title 42 looks set to be lifted in coming months, possibly, more migrants have been arriving again in the hope of crossing that border.
Vanessa Bushluter, our Latin America regional editor, thank you so much for joining us. Right, I'm now going to take the shortest journey I've ever made from one desk to another. Ready, done. It's 1 metre. And Paul Kirby, our Europe regional editor, who we spoke to yesterday on the programme, has kindly agreed to join us. Paul, you look like you're working very busily, as Vanessa and I were speaking in your shadow just now. We're going to be speaking about a very interesting, important topic, the fact that a US journalist working for the Wall Street Journal has been formally arrested in Russia and accused of spying. His name is Evan Gershkovich, an experienced Russia reporter who was working in Yekaterinburg at the time of his detention. Take us through what happened to him.
This is something that's really shocked the journalistic community in Russia, actually, and it's quite a beleaguered community of foreign journalists in particular. Evan Gershkovich was working, as you say, in Yekaterinburg, and according to the Wall Street Journal, he'd been talking to his editors but dropped out of contact yesterday afternoon, that's Wednesday afternoon, while he was reporting there. And as far as we understand, he was reporting on this mercenary group, very shadowy mercenary group that's been fighting in Ukraine. So the whole thing revolves around the war in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale